Good evening and welcome to the People for Effective Government online event. We're glad to have you with us. My name is Jenny Darrell and I currently serve as PEG's board president. PEG is a nonprofit, Spokane-based nonpartisan coalition. Our mission is to support bipartisan approaches to governing, which are fiscally responsible, ensure an adequate social safety net, and promote a civil society. We've been holding in-person forums and online events for over 2 years. If you've attended our events in the past, we thank you. For those of you who are new to our organization and events, we look forward to having you with us in the future. The PEG board is doing this work for you. The members of PEG are committed to changing the current political climate in which our two major parties, have become increasingly polarized. We are working to encourage sincere and civil debate about the challenges our nation faces, about effective solutions to those challenges. We are a small grassroots organization working with very shallow pockets. If you are finding these events helpful as you think about issues in government at the local, state, and federal level, please consider joining us as a member or making a donation to PEG. We are a 501c3 nonprofit relying on membership dues and donations to cover our costs. The board members are all dues-paying volunteers. If you're interested in learning more about PEG and possibly becoming a member, please visit our website at www.pegnow.org. We will be adding an electronic payment feature to our website very soon. In the meantime, you can join or donate by downloading and completing a form that is listed on the Get Involved tab of our website. Please help us continue to host these free public events. Dues are $60 per person per year, and of course, any donation would help. And just a reminder, the views presented by our guest speakers, whether during online events or in-person forums, are their own. As a 501c3 nonprofit, PEG neither participates in political campaigns on behalf of or in opposition to any candidate for public office, nor engages in political activity of any kind. Now I'll turn the program over to our moderators for this evening's presentation. PEG board members Mark Kenny and Barb Kerr.
Thank you, Jenny. I'm Mark Kenny, and I'll be co-moderating this forum this evening with my fellow PEG board member, Barb Kerr. Say hello to the folks, Barb.
Hello.
Thanks, Barb. It's my honor to introduce tonight's guest speaker, Mr. Jim McDevitt, who will speak on the topic, Nonpartisan Justice in a Partisan Environment, and I'll begin by sharing his bio. Jim McDevitt was raised in the Bellevue area and attended the University of Washington for his undergraduate studies. After active duty service in the U.S. Air Force, he attended Gonzaga Law School and attained an MBA from Gonzaga School of Business as well. Mr. McDevitt practiced law in Spokane for 45 years in roles including 3 years as Assistant Attorney General under then Attorney General Slade Gorton, 25 years in private practice, culminating as a partner with the firm of Preston, Gates, and Ellis. And he was appointed United States Attorney for the Eastern District of Washington in 2001 by President Bush and continued under President Obama until 2010. He served 5 years from 2011 to 2016 as General Counsel to Spokane Airports, and in 2016 was appointed the City of Spokane's Law Enforcement Director, which is the equivalent of being a civilian police chief. He now has a part-time practice serving multiple airports. Mr. McDevitt served 5 years active duty in the U.S. Air Force, starting as a B-52 navigator and F-4 Phantom weapons system officer, and 30 years in the Washington Air National Guard, starting as an F-101 Voodoo weapons system officer and ending his career as a KC-135 navigator. He held command positions at all levels, including deployment for a year as an active duty tanker squadron commander during operations Desert Shield and Desert Storm in Saudi Arabia, His last position was as Chief of Staff and Vice Commander of the Washington Air National Guard, and he retired at the rank of Brigadier General. He is currently chair of the Washington State Governor's Clemency and Pardons Board and is one of the authors of The Blueprint for Reform, a roadmap for improving the delivery of criminal justice in Spokane County. He does all these things when he's not flying his Cessna 185 or fly fishing the rivers and streams of North Idaho and Western Montana. Mr. McDevitt, thank you for being with us this evening.
Thank you, Mark. Thanks a lot. And as you can see from that, I title that as I haven't decided what I want to be when I grow up. I've never been able to hold a job down for very long.
There's nothing wrong with that. Go ahead, Barb.
I'm Barb, and tonight's forum will be a 1-hour moderated presentation by our guest speaker on a range of topics, including steps to promote effective government, political influence in the justice system, and then war stories on a variety of topics that should be familiar to many of you. Mr. McDevitt, you will have the floor during tonight's presentation, but Mark and I may interject with questions occasionally. We expect Mr. McDevitt will speak for 45 to 60 minutes, and we will reserve time at the end of the webinar for questions from our audience. Please submit your questions via the Q&A feature. Please be brief and only ask one question at a time. It is best if your questions are only 2 to 3 sentences long. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Mr. Jim McDevitt.
Well, thank you, Barb, and thank you, Mark. Thanks a lot. I'm honored to be here and honored to have been asked to talk with you folks and with your attendees and your membership. I've looked at your website and I applaud your goals and what you've done and the positions you've taken. I actually think we need a lot more of that. Folks that actually talk to each other and listen to each other. The listening more important than the talking. But thank you very, very much, and I certainly welcome any questions and hope that maybe in my rambling that some of this is helpful and might make some sense. As Barb said, I'm going to talk about 3 things: steps to promote effective government, when politics creeps into the justice system, which I saw up close and personal, and then some war stories that might be familiar to some folks that have lived in Spokane for some period of time. And then, of course, answer any questions that anybody has, either along the way or at the end. With respect to steps to promote effective government, I'm sort of prejudiced in that direction. And I would use the U.S. Attorney's position as an example. And a little background for those that may or may not know, there are 93 United States attorneys throughout the United States and its possessions, 94 districts, 1 being combined, the Guam and the Marianas. Each United States attorney is appointed by the president, confirmed by the Senate, ultimately, unless there's a vacancy, and then of course the court can promote one temporarily. I actually favor that, not just because I was a recipient. It came as somewhat of a surprise. I hadn't planned on that during my law career. I was comfortable in a corporate practice with Preston Gates, but all of a sudden the opportunity arose. And using the U.S. Attorney as an example of someone who comes in from industry or from outside of government, brings non-governmental think to the job, and is not really looking to make it a career. In my case, I served 9 years. That's a little longer than normal. My successor, Mike Ormsby, and some of you may know Mike, my good friend and former law partner, served, I think, 6 years. And so it depends. But by the same token, the current U.S. Attorney, my good friend Bill Hislop, came out as a partner with the Lucan-Zanis firm. And I'll use my case as an example, but the same kinds of things are being done in some degree throughout the country. And I know Mike Ormsey and Bill Hislop. I kind of brought a private practice management. I had between 28 and 30 lawyers, assistant United States attorneys in 3 offices, Spokane, Yakima, and the Tri-Cities. I brought private practice management. I started the first year with what I called partner interviews, and each year I would spend about an hour and a half with each partner, each lawyer, asking them, are they happy with what they do? Are they getting enough training, et cetera, et cetera? The reaction I got from some of the career, and they're all career prosecutors, was, gee, I've been in government service for 15 years and nobody's ever asked me if I liked what I was doing. And I said, well, I want to know. I mean, I want you to enjoy what you're doing. I want to make sure. So I did partner interviews. One of the problems I inherited from the inspections done prior to my tenure, and the Eastern District of Washington is the 20 of the 39 counties east of the Cascades. The office had pretty much dropped out of sight. There was very, very little outreach. Nobody really knew. And that's a problem because the United States Attorney's Office with all the federal agencies has tremendous power and can really leverage that power with local jurisdictions. And so I inherited an office that had almost kind of dropped out of sight. So the first thing we did was we put together about a 3-ring binder, about 2 inches thick, of everything you ever wanted to know about federal law enforcement east of the Cascades. And then I commenced to visit, and there was a nice thing about having a little airplane. I commenced to visit 20 county prosecutors, everything from a SOTN and 20 county prosecutors, 20 county sheriffs, and 85 police chiefs. And it took me 7 months with a couple days a week, flying everywhere from Goldendale to Asotin to Yakima to Winthrop, etc. And the reaction I got was tremendous because a couple of sheriffs said, gee, I've been a sheriff for 20 years and I'd never even spoken to the U.S. attorney. Now he's sitting in my office, drinking bad coffee and eating a stale donut. The reason I did that was because I believe that marketing and what we could do for local jurisdictions from the standpoint of federal grants under Project Safe Neighborhoods, some of the youth programs, the outreach programs, partnering on large drug cartel cases, making sure that they knew that my office was open for business and to handle their more difficult cases that had a federal ring to them. So that kind of marketing, I think, not that it's totally unique, but I mean, that again came from private industry, private practice. I had open management, open door, open management, staff, regular weekly staff meetings, attorney meetings, continuous training, and set up a bonus matrix to where we had authorized money at the end of the year where we could give out bonuses based upon performance. I didn't worry about my job. One of the misnomers is you keep hearing that so-and-so U.S. attorney was fired. U.S. attorneys are never fired. I mean, that's a misnomer. You serve at the pleasure of the president. Now, you may not be expected to be asked to leave, but you're never fired. The press loves to play with that, but that's not true. You serve at the pleasure of the president. When the president appoints someone else or asks you to step down, you salute smartly and step away. That's the name of the game. It is a completely at will. And that's another benefit to that is that I didn't have to worry about where my next meal was going to come from. I came out of private industry as a partner with a huge firm. Preston Gates was a 500 lawyer firm. I was the corporate partner in Spokane. You know, I could go back into private practice in a heartbeat. So I didn't worry about, and I'll cover that a little bit later about politics, because I ran headlong into that. But again, I think that's one of the benefits in some of these positions of coming out of private practice, private industry, is you've already got some skills. You're not dependent upon the government for a career, And if somebody gives you an order that you don't think you can follow, you say, I can't do that, and you resign. And you go back, you don't fear for your job, and you don't worry about pleasing everyone for a career. I think there are valuable input from private non-government, the experiences, the problems. There are problems with internal promotions up to the top, any level, and the top levels especially, because the person usually doesn't have a lot of experience in private industry and private management. Oftentimes they're part of a career path. They've got embedded, friends and this sort of thing, and they're not willing. And I ran into the same thing where the individual that I succeeded wasn't willing to make some tough decisions on some personnel matters where some disciplinary, discipline was important. And I'm fair, but I expect people to do their work, and I expect them to give the government and the taxpayer their dollar. So there's a problem with that. The independence and having a job to go back to, I think, is important, and that's pretty much. And I'll cover a couple of cases a little later on about effective government, but that's kind of my take on effective government and how whether it's career politicians or even career bureaucrats, I think there are inherent problems with that. And I'm more of the citizen legislator and even citizen soldier. I mean, the same thing was true during my tenure in the Guard. One of my jobs in the later years as a general officer was coordination with the Pentagon and with Congress. And again, every once in a while, I ruffled a few feathers among the 3 stars and the 4 stars on what we needed for Washington. But I didn't worry because I had a job to go back to, or I had a regular job, as we would call it, in addition to being, a citizen soldier. So the citizen legislator, citizen soldier, citizen bureaucrat, I'm a firm believer. Any questions on that?
Before you move on, Jim, just before you move on, I might ask a question about, you talked about serving at the pleasure of the president, and there was a recent high-profile transition of U.S. attorneys in the Southern District of New York. Do you think that was a typical transition? And this may lead into your next topic of when politics creep into justice. Are you familiar with that?
Yeah, I am, and I don't know. I'm not part of the system right now. I don't have as I did before. I don't have a pipeline directly to what's going on and within the community. I can only speak from my, the optics aren't good, but you never really know. I can tell you firsthand, and I don't know whether that answers your question, but that none of those, the optics never look real good, and you never really know until you get, down deep into the politics of it. I saw that when I interviewed, the last interview, the FBI does a background check, and they interviewed, in my case, about 75 people throughout the community. Mainly, they don't want anything in your background that's going to come up and bite you. They don't want any surprises, and you fill out probably a foot thick stack of paperwork and financial disclosures and all that, and then they interview everybody from your neighbors to. My wife is still upset that they didn't interview her. I don't know what she would have said, but anyway, she's upset. Lawyers that you've been against, lawyers you've worked with, employees. I mean, they do a very, very thorough background check. And and a couple of interviews, and the last one was with then Attorney General John Ashcroft. Now, say what you want about John Ashcroft, but I'll never forget sitting in his office in the Justice Department of DC, where he said, if I ever find that anything you do during your tenure was politically motivated in any way, shape, or form, you're gone. Well, I could live with that. And as a matter of fact, within 6 months, an individual, not from around here, showed up as an endorsement on a little political mailer for his brother-in-law who was running for some borough or county or something seat in the Southwest, and Ashcroft fired him. I mean, he meant it. Now, I wish that he'd have stayed on, because he felt he pulled up the gangplank to the White House, and he did what the Attorney General should do, and that is he was the attorney for the people and was independent. Now, when he left, I can't say that that continued, because if you remember in 2006, those who were keeping track, there were 8 U.S. attorneys fired. That was political. John McKay from the Western District in Seattle, David Iglesias out of New Mexico, a number of others, 8 U.S. attorneys were fired. That turned out to be very political. And I say the rest of us, the remaining 85 were madder than the devil. And various people expressed that anger in various ways. I had the opportunity to, I'll tell you, in fact, one particular one which stood out was David Iglesias. And David wrote a book called Injustice, which is worth reading. David was the U.S. Attorney for New Mexico. If you remember what was the Tom Cruise, was it A Few Good Men, or David was actually the Marine or the Navy lawyer that was prosecuted that case. And actually, David's better looking than Tom Cruise. But anyway, David was actually the lawyer on that case when he was on active duty. David, his problem was there was an investigation going of a woman who was running for the House. And one of the senators was trying to put pressure on David to finish up the investigation before the election and file charges. Well, that you don't do. It's a no-no with the Justice Department to do anything that will disrupt an election. And David wouldn't do it. And so that particular senator, I think it was Senator Domenici, was upset. And yeah, Domenici, and he was the one that was behind the recommendation that David be fired. Well, that little trick on Domenici's part got him a trip before the Senate Ethics Committee and a slap, because that just isn't done. But that was an example. But we were all upset with that, and Gonzalez, the then Attorney General, knew that, so he started what we within the community called affectionately his apology and farewell tour, because he started meeting with various U.S. attorneys, and I met with him in Chicago. Pat Fitzgerald. Pat was the U.S. attorney who sent 2 Illinois governors to prison. 5 of us met with Gonzalez, and I was the first one. I've never known when to shut my mouth, and I kind of, in a professional manner, opened up and essentially said, "What the hell were you thinking? I mean, what did you think this would go?" And he was getting advice that this would be kind of a one-day splash in the paper and gone. Well, it survived to this day. And I unloaded in a professional manner in Pat Fitzgerald's office with the Attorney General, who was very contrite and admitted, yeah. And then when I finished, Pat Fitzgerald said, "Mr. Attorney General, what Jim is saying is pull up the gangplank to the White House. You are not the president's lawyer. You're the people's lawyer." And so that was under the Bush administration. That was when politics creeps in. But there were enough of us that raised holy hell and said that's not the right thing, that it wasn't very long after that that Gonzalez was replaced by Judge Michael McCasey, who had been a federal district court judge and was a real straight shooter and wouldn't put up with that. And the problem was, I don't really think Bush knew much about it. He left everything up to, as you do, he left everything up to the Attorney General, who really put a black mark on his career in that regard. I survived that, even though I professionally chastised the Attorney General. We fast forward then to my term, and I served under 4 attorneys general and 2 presidents. And I was continued for 2 years, reappointed for 2 years, or continued under President Obama while they worked through Mike Ormsby's appointment. And again, I saw the same kind of, in a different degree, creep in. One of the things that Eric Holder lauded, and he was a real gentleman, but he bragged that he was the president's wingman, and he was the president's wingman. And of course, in the Air Force, that has a particular connotation of a close confidant, and it made no secret of the fact that he was essentially carrying out the orders of the president. I had a run-in with him over a personnel matter where one of my lawyers that I'd hired had been involved in the Ted Stevens prosecution, and the judge in that asked for an investigation. So Holder asked me, said he wanted me to sideline, shove at some desk and at a side that lawyer during the investigation. And I said to his deputy, who was carrying out Holder's orders, absolutely not. I believe in the old adage, innocent until proven guilty. And there's an investigation, but that doesn't mean anything. And as a matter of fact, this lawyer, who's still with the office, was found to be completely exonerated. And now the government has to pay back close to $500,000 of his attorney's fees. But I refused to sideline that lawyer on Holder's orders. I was reminded that I served at his pleasure. And I said, well, for crying out loud, don't send me back into private practice where I'll double my income. I mean, don't do that to me. And about a day later, he backed down and said, okay, you do what you want with him, but I'm concerned. Well, the concern came to nothing. But there were a number of things, and not doesn't necessarily detail where I could see that there was too close a relationship with the president, and things had changed, procedures had changed, not to my liking, at least. Fast and Furious was another one of those. Everybody knew that was going on. I mean, for crying out loud, anyway.
Ill-conceived at best.
What was it?
It was Fast and Furious was allowing guns to be traded across the Mexican border to see where they ended up.
Oh.
And it ended up, one of them ended up shooting and killing a border patrolman. Mm-hmm. And so that whole thing, the higher ups in DC, and that's where all the problems come from. The districts have no problem. The further away from DC, the better off you are. I got into practice, just kidding. Of not answering area code 202 calls and letting them go to voicemail. I'm just kidding, of course. But it was common practice to allow contraband in the northern border, allow contraband to cross the border and try to follow it to get to the higher ups, because the mules who were carrying this stuff, dope, guns, whatever, they didn't know where it was going or where it came from, and they were useless to you. You could put them in jail by the dozen, but what you wanted to do was get to the higher ups. So you would often, what we call let a load go, let a load of dope, or in this case in the southern border, a load of guns go, so you could trace them. Well, the problem was they lost track of them, and they ended up in the hands of the cartel, and one of them killed a border patrolman. Now, that was my experience with under Bush and under Holder, where I saw politics creep in, didn't like it. It was reality. I'm not on the inside right now. I can't, I can tell you that the optics and some of the things going on aren't good. And time will tell. But I can't really comment on the current president or the current attorney general, other than the fact that at least the way the press plays some of it, on some of the things, the optics don't look good. I guess I would say this: the U.S. attorney has got to hold the line. I had no problem with that. Usually, you have a good job to go back to. You're not worried about a career because you know with the next party or the next president, you're likely to be removed. When Clinton came in, he fired all the U.S. attorneys overnight. When Obama came in, to his credit, he allowed the U.S. attorneys to stay on until a replacement was vetted and approved by the Senate. Trump came in and canned a whole bunch of them overnight. That's the president's prerogative. You can't tie that to either party. It happens.
Let me ask you a question quickly about that, Jim, then. President Trump, as you know, is big on Twitter. And while Sessions was the AG, he bullied him mercilessly through Twitter. And what do you think about that as politics creeping into the justice system?
Well, again, the optics are terrible. I think somebody needs to take away his Twitter. That gets him in more trouble than anything else. That's inappropriate. And to Sessions' credit, I think he stood his ground, as he should. It shouldn't matter. I mean, maybe that's wishful thinking, but at least in my view. But I can say this: number one, I had a job to go back to. Number two, even though the district is huge geographically, it's what we call a flyover district. In other words, there are no direct flights to DC. There are no huge Seattle, San Francisco, where you've got some great big corporate crime. Not that we didn't have enough of our own, but you don't have the same high profile that you do in Los Angeles. You know, the LA office, for example, my friend Deb Yang, who was the attorney down there, she had 250 assistant U.S. attorneys. I had 30. Seattle has 65 or 70. I mean, so the size of the office and all that has a little bit to do. The distance from DC has a lot to do. I used to kid John McKay, my counterpart on the West Side, that I had all the cows and he had all the people. And I had a much easier job of it. So I don't know whether that answers your question, but from the standpoint,
I appreciate it.
From the standpoint of war stories, and some of them will relate back to what I said, one of the cases that turned out to be, and I say these are fun cases, that no case where you're putting people in prison is fun, but some of them present their own unique challenge. One of them, and I would ask if anybody remembers, is the St. Regis University case. Now, they had a website. On their website was this real regal looking building, which happened to be the birthplace of Sir Winston Churchill, and it wasn't a university. And they offered online degrees, and you had to fill out a little test, and you could get anything from a 30 to a 90 on a 100-question test. It didn't matter, you passed anyway. They gave out, before we brought charges, over 10,000 degrees to 9,614 people. I called it, when we announced the indictment, I called it, from my GED to my PhD, the longest 2 weeks of my life, because literally you could buy a master's, a PhD, you could have it printed on Harvard or Princeton or Yale or whatever. You paid a little extra and you got a transcript with all A's. You paid a little more and you got magna cum laude. A little more, you got summa cum laude. It was a total fraud. And it was interstate. And of course, we had plenty of jurisdiction. They had a boiler room where they, on one end of the table, the marketing person was answering calls from the website, this grandiose looking website with a picture of this castle on there. There wasn't their university. And at the other end of the table, because with your degree, you could give your employer a degree verification number. If your employer wanted to verify you got a degree, he'd call this number. Well, at the other end of the same marketing table was another telephone, and somebody would pick that up and verify your degree. So they got you coming and going. It was an absolute total fraud. Our task force had so much fun. One of our task force officers from Secret Service, and we had folks from the police department and the sheriff's office and various federal agencies as part of the task force. One of the Secret Service members posed as a Syrian army officer. Now, we don't have real good relations with Syria. He was a Syrian army officer that wanted an H-2 visa, so he needed a PhD. And so he got a PhD in a matter of a couple of weeks that he could use to try to buttress up his H-2 visa. So that was a case where we had no idea until we started peeling the layers off the onion how deep this thing went, and had no idea until we really got into it that this was a global, I can't remember, I think there were 210 countries involved in degrees and 9,614 people. Teachers used the degrees to increase their pay. A couple of law enforcement officers used them to do that. I mean, various people.
Some military folks too, wasn't there?
Oh yeah, and we had. I remember I had a call from the superintendent of schools of Oregon saying, "Could you tell us which Oregon teachers got degrees?" And I said, "I'll tell you what, I'll give you a list of all the degrees. You do your own research. I'm not going to do that. We're busy enough." So, but yeah, it was. Some people thought they were legitimate. Some people knew it was a scam. We were asked if we were going to go after people that got the degrees and got bumps, and we said, nope, we're going to be done when we prosecute the people that are behind this whole thing. We're not going to go after the individual degree holders. I'd have to set up an entire battalion of lawyers to do that. So that was an interesting case. Another one you may be familiar with is the AutoZem case. That happened in 2006 on my watch. It was a case that was politically very hot. The local prosecutor hadn't, for whatever reason, touched it. We started an investigation. Law enforcement was a little hesitant because they don't like to second guess a law enforcement officer. So the federal law enforcement was a little hesitant until one day, one of the senior agents came in and said, Jim, they're lying to the grand jury. They're being prepped on the way in, debriefed on the way out, and they're lying to the grand jury. And it was shortly after that that the city attorney and deputy city attorney, who found out about the investigation, met me in my office, told me how unpopular that case was with them, with the mayor, and that if I indicted a police officer, number one, no jury would ever convict a police officer. That proved to be wrong. And number two, I would be the most unpopular guy in all of Washington if I did that. And my answer was, well, you need to know that poking the United States attorney in the eye with a sharp stick gets you nowhere. And the other thing is, when Bush appointed me to this job, popularity was not part of my agenda. So we're going to do whatever's necessary, because we were having trouble getting documents and evidence, like 2 of the 4 store security cameras. It's out of the 7-Eleven, et cetera, et cetera. Well, at the end of that case, the Mayor Werner, lost her job in part because of the way she'd handled that case. The city attorney and deputy city attorney lost their jobs under the new mayor. the credibility of the police department went into the toilet. I mean, that was a real low point. And a Spokane police officer spent 4.5 years in federal prison, convicted of a civil rights charge and obstruction of justice by a Yakima jury after a change of venue motion by the defense. So the results of that, I mean, again, I wouldn't say I'm proud of that case, but it was a case where you need to stick up for what's right. And you can't sit there and let the slings and arrows, even from the mayor or other law enforcement or whatever, deter you from what's right.
Well, let me ask you a quick question about that. And you mentioned it when you teed this up, but the county prosecutor has, he's able to decide what to charge and what not to charge, right? He has discretion.
You can decline case.
Did you have a discussion with him before you chose to take the case, or?
I think my criminal chief did, and he, quite frankly, he was relieved that somebody else would handle it. I think I would say that. It was kind of like because he was getting a little heat about that, and nothing was happening. And so when we said, hey, give us your file, which he has no choice but to do, I think he was relieved. But again, I mean, I'm just guessing because we had no objection.
I'm sure. I remember at the time it was a real political hot potato.
Oh yeah,
locally.
And that's the thing. I mean, I can remember I indicted a Forest Service supervisor in the 30 Mile fire up out of Winthrop, and the head of Forest Service for the Northwest, when I told that individual that I was going to start an investigation, that individual said, well, that's you need to stay out of that. That's Forest Service business. And I said, ma'am, I just had the parents of 4 young people, 8 parents in my office saying they're not getting any answers, nothing's being done, and I'm going to look into it. And this individual said, well, you can't do that. I won't allow you. I won't let it. And I said, well, I'm sorry, but I don't work for you. The U.S. attorney is completely independent and does whatever he or she wants to within the law. And that individual said, well, you can expect to hear from the Secretary of Agriculture, who's over the Forest Service. And I turned to that individual and said, if I hear from the Secretary of Agriculture, I'll add you to the indictment for obstruction of justice. I never got a call from the Secretary of Agriculture, never heard a thing. We indicted the fire boss, and he ended up pleading to lying to investigators. So, I mean, that's the degree. I never knew going in how much independence and discretion the individual had, especially in a wide district like this. So it's something that you exercise carefully, and not for. I remember when we charged the Republican mayor of a small town, and I got a little heat from some individual from the party that called me in, and I said, look at the door where it says United States Attorney. Does it say Republican United States Attorney? I hope not, because you do the crime, you do the time. That's just that simple. So.
Hey, Jim, before we go to the next war story, I just want to remind the audience that you can submit questions through the Q&A function at any time. So if you've been thinking about something that we've covered, go ahead and submit a question, and we're probably within about 10-15 minutes of our Q&A session.
Right.
So, thanks. Go ahead.
I have a question.
Go ahead, Barb.
You have spent a lifetime in the military, and you've been in a lot of leadership positions. You have more courage to just take things on than I think a lot of people do. Do you think it's because of your military background, or is that just you?
Oh, I don't know. I tell people, and I get a chance to go over to my old ROTC unit at the University of Washington occasionally and to tell them what little I know about leadership, and the same thing with the bar. In fact, I have to give In about 2 weeks, I give an online kind of a lecture on leadership and that to Bob Ferguson, the Attorney General's summer interns. I tell young people in the military, don't ever discount what you're learning from the standpoint of ethics and leadership. And I would, quite frankly, and it's appropriate, it's a good question, I would lay a lot of that back on the military upbringing, not just on active duty, learning to be a part of something bigger than yourself, learning to put your interests. You know, when I took over the police department, I gave them my standard squadron lecture. Rule number 1, tell me the truth. Absolutely always tell me the truth, and we'll deal with it, whatever we need to do. Rule number 2, give me 110% in whatever you are, whether you're a pilot, a navigator, a boom operator, a patrolman, a detective, give me 110%. I'll take care of all of the rest. Number 3, make every decision putting the interests of the city, its people, or the country ahead of your own. And number 4, reread rule number 1 of telling me the truth. And you just heard the lecture I gave when I took over the police department, which wasn't easy because if you remember, 6 years prior to that, I sent one of their own police officers to prison. So I was about as popular as a pickpocket in church originally, until they found out that I knew a little bit about how to deal with, how to lead. So I think I would have to say the military had a lot to do with it. I guess that's where I'd lay the blame, Barb.
Do you think anybody else could have taken over the police department at that time that you knew?
Oh, probably. I don't want to pat myself unduly. I mean, it was interesting because I'm sitting in a room with Officer Thompson's, a bunch of his best friends, and we got that out right away. I just said, in case you want to know why that went so bad, where a case that could have ended up with a plea and a better resolution ended up with a trial and serious prison time because you start playing games with the federal prosecutor. As I say, you poke the U.S. attorney in the eye with a sharp stick, you have no idea the resources, the grand jury, wiretaps, mail covers, FBI. I mean, you want to get to the truth, that's the way you do it. So we got that out of the way right away at the first staff meeting. And I said, anybody who wants to know why that went off the rails, you're welcome to come into my office and I'll tell you. Other than that, and I'd already talked to Zem's parents because I even told the press, I said, AutoZem is behind us. This is a new day. I look forward, not backward. It does no good to sit there and point fingers and try to assess blame. That gets you nowhere. That's always been my philosophy. So. Another case, very quickly, the odometer rollback case, which again, we started peeling the onions. We found out we had somebody come in, and again, it was cross-border, interstate, found out that there were several auto dealers and folks in the auto business in town in this region that were buying Canadian rental cars. And when they changed the odometer out from kilometers to miles, somehow they lost mileage up to, there was one rental, as I told Mark, that lost 100,000 miles in the odometer transfer. So we started that, charged several auto dealers or auto traders, ended up recovering, no jail time, but ended up recovering a pretty good sized sum of money, which we put in a pot and paid people back who could prove that their car was one of the ones that was overvalued because of the underreporting of mileage. It was an interesting case. And again, it was one of those ones where you start peeling back the layers and it got bigger and bigger and bigger. One case back to effective government, two cases against DSHS. One was out of a DSHS contractor in the Tri-Cities who had set up was basically on a contract with DSHS for a number of different functions, set up some limited liability companies for his wife and his daughter, and et cetera, et cetera. And by the time it came to light, he had siphoned over $250,000 of DSHS money. Well, we got involved in it and found out that he, in spite of being awarded this huge contract with DSHS, had a felony conviction for welfare or for Medicare fraud, I think it was, down in the Southeast somewhere. And he got his degree while he was in prison. Well, I had a meeting with the higher ups of DSHS and my prosecutor who was handling the case out of Yakima. And I said, number one, didn't you know this individual had a felony conviction before you turned him loose with all this DSHS money? Oh no, we don't do nationwide criminal background checks. Number one, they cost us a little more money. And number two, we think it's an invasion of privacy. And I said, what about the taxpayer who just had to foot the bill for $250,000 that went out? I said, that is ridiculous. I mean, I just went through the roof. And this Kathy Mix, the assistant AG, was part of the conversation. And I said, the second thing is, we want all this individual's personnel records. And those people have hired him. And the deputy assistant for DSHS said, well, we can't give those to you. They're confidential. And I said, you don't understand. We have a federal subpoena out. You either give me those, give Jill Bolton, my prosecutor, the records by Friday, or the head of your agency, the head of DSHS, is going to be in front of the grand jury in Spokane explaining why not. And he turned to the deputy attorney general who worked for Chris Gregoire, said, can he do that? And Kathy Mix said, yes, he can. And yes, he will. We got the records right away. The other one that was mismanagement was the Mattawa daycare case, where again, the Grant County prosecutor, sheriff, was investigating a case in Mattawa of daycare fraud. And he got sued by Columbia Legal Services for discrimination because all of the folks he was investigating were Hispanic. And so he dropped the case, turned it over to us. And of course, we don't have to be concerned with that. We started looking into it, and there were 5 daycare operators, at least 5. There were more daycare operators in Mattawa, if you know where Mattawa is, than there were kids. And they were all DSHS. So the first question from the defense lawyers was, why are you involved? And the answer was, because if there's a single federal dollar that flows through, just like this whole problem with the Nigerian fraud on our employment, which gives reason for the U.S. attorney to look into that. As long as there's one federal dollar that's involved in a state program, that gives the U.S. attorney the ability to look into the case. So we looked into it, and we found that DSHS was getting these attendance sheets regularly from these daycare operators, where each one of the daycare operator would have the same kid listed on 2 or 3 or 4 attendance sheets on the same day. So they were falsifying the attendance. And I think the largest amount that was taken was, I think, up in the 6 figures from the standpoint of DSHS payments to authorized payments to daycare. So we indicted, I think, the five female and Hispanic daycare operators. And of course, I got some heat over that because all of the defendants were Hispanic, and whoever it was didn't realize that 97% of Mattawa is Hispanic. So it's pretty hard not to do that. That all ended up in a plea. The problem I had with DSHS, just like the lack of a background check initially on this other case, which I thought was absolutely incredibly stupid. In this case, they knew they were double counting on these daycare sheets and all that, but they treated them as mistakes, even though they were sworn statements. And I said, there's a difference between a mistake and fraud. this is fraud, criminal fraud. Well, their attitude was, oh, well, you know, I mean, we don't want to be too harsh. And I said, well, I do, because that's the way I operate. This, I mean, again, you're talking about taxpayer money, and you're talking about people that are committing absolute fraud. And that, within a month after I stepped down in 2010 and the start of 2011, Governor Gregoire and the head of DSHS was getting all kinds of heat. A King TV investigation over EBT, electronic benefits cards, being sold and stolen, etc. And so I was hired. I was no longer the U.S. attorney. I was hired by the governor, by DSHS, to do an internal investigation as to why there was so much fraud. There was one individual I remember had lost his benefits card 22 times in the same month. Now, when you lose your benefits card and it's used again, that means you also lost the code, or the little code you need to use along with it. Well, again, in a half a year long internal investigation of DSHS, I found that they didn't like, number one, all of these cases only involved a couple $1,000s or so, and they really didn't want to waste the time going after. And number two, they didn't want to be too hard on people that were utilizing electronic benefits card, even though there was absolute rampant fraud on the part of the individual. And we did a computer program and found out that there were, in downtown Seattle, for example, there were a half a dozen or so mom and pop stores that the amount of EBT, because these stores would buy the card for 50 cents on the dollar that was left on the card and sell it for 75 cents on the dollar to somebody else, along with the PIN number. So you could see these mom and pop stores were involved in wholesale buying and selling of these EBT cards. And again, the philosophy of DSHS was more of a kind of and I don't want to make light of it, a caregiver mentality. And there's nothing wrong with that, except that there are times when criminal activity raises its ugly head. You got to take a tough stand. And that was an example of one of those cases. And again, that case was resolved with plea agreements. Another case, real quickly, is the South Hill marijuana case. You may remember that. There were 5 people in their 60s and over decided they could bolster their income by growing marijuana in houses that they were buying up in the south part of Spokane. Actually, there's one about 3 blocks from me. And they had grow ops in the basement of all these houses. And the way we got onto it is the young lady in the South Hill branch of a young teller went to her boss and said, this guy's coming in twice a week with $8,000 and $9,000 cash deposits. Number one, as you know, that's structuring to avoid the $10,000 reporting limit. And number two, she said, and only this young lady would know, that the money smelled like marijuana. So the sheriff got us involved, and we put up cameras, did the typical survey of the utility bills on the house to see how much electricity. And these houses were supposed to be vacant because the people were on vacation and they had people coming in to do the lawn, but they were using a heck of a lot of power, which grow houses do. And then we did some controlled buys, and we ended up seizing about $4 million worth of houses, Jeeps, $110,000 fur coat from France, Rolex watches, et cetera, and Judge Nielsen had the case, and they were again arguing age and infirmity and all that, and Judge Nielsen wouldn't have it. He said, your only infirmity was you were making over $1 million a year on this marijuana grow op, and you're all going to go to jail. And I think everybody did, except for one fellow who was terminally ill. One case that I would end with, on more of a light note, I call the monkey case, because we do get some hilarious cases. There's a woman that fell in love with a rhesus macaque monkey in Thailand. Well, that is a prohibited animal to bring into the States because of all the diseases it carries. Well, she didn't care because she liked this little monkey. So she doped the monkey up, put it in a cloth sack, hid it under a maternity smock and pretended like she was pregnant, and made it through customs at LAX, which doesn't give you a lot of faith in customs. Got up to Spokane, and then guess what? She put pictures of the monkey on her Facebook, and somebody dimed her out. So we prosecuted her, and of course, we had to seize the monkey, and my office they were protesting because I think we ended up having to put the monkey down. But there was a save the monkey kind of a deal. But Stephanie Van Marter, one of my younger prosecutors, had that case. And so we bought her a little hat with a monkey on it and kept littering her office with little stuffed monkeys and this sort of thing. So one of those cases that, again, you have to hit yourself in the forehead and say, what the hell was this person thinking? And especially, this isn't the first time people brag about these things on Facebook until somebody says, hey, guess what? So anyway, that's the end of the war stories, and that's the end of an hour. So any questions that you folks have, or any from the audience?
Well, Jim, I just want to thank you on behalf of PEG and our audience members for a very informative and entertaining hour. And we're happy to be able to present you with some questions. And Barb, do you have the Q&A there? We have 4 questions on Q&A.
Yeah, I do.
Okay, go ahead and choose one off there. Maybe the first one.
It says, how has the justice system evolved over your career? Perhaps you could talk a bit about the blueprint for reform you co-authored and some of its recommendations.
Well, I guess we're talking about the local justice system. When Judge Murphy and Dutch Wetzel and I did the blueprint back years ago, we found things to be very, very dysfunctional. I mean, everything was stovepiped. I mean, the various agencies weren't talking to each other, weren't trying to really, there was a lot of distrust. So we did the blueprint. It was about a couple 100 pages. We didn't pull any punches, and we made a few people mad, but they deserved to be called out. And again, we did it without fear or favor. But right now, as a matter of fact, we're doing a report card, which has been sort of delayed because of the virus. And we're having to do all of our meetings on Zoom, but we're almost finished with the report card. And I would have to tell you, an early look, there have been some tremendous strides made. There's a lot of trust. There are still some folks, there's still some duplication of effort, which we'll point out. There are still some people that haven't quite got with the program. Over 70% of the county's budget goes into the law and justice area. So that's a big concern of the county, and a like amount, I don't know percentage wise, of the city's budget goes into municipal court and the police and all that. So we're pretty happy with the areas that I've really focused on is a jail, or detention services, the sheriff and the police, and the kinds of things they're doing, the outreach kinds of programs, and again, trying to get in touch with the youth. And the younger you can get a hold of kids and help them make the right choices, the better they are and all that. So there's been a lot of progress made. I'm generally pretty happy with what's happened over the past several years. Now there's a lot of things that take big dollars. One of our big recommendations was a community correction center, and that hasn't happened. But again, we were asked to do this without regard to money. And so it's easy to make all kinds of plans and dreams, as you know, without money. But a community correction center, which like Hillsboro, Oregon has, which is very successful, is a halfway house between jail and the community, is something that really would help, I think, a lot. But again, Barb, it's a big price tag.
I have another question, and this is my question. Can you comment on Sheriff Ozzie Knizovich's comments in the June 29th edition of the SR when he said, where he said about leaders in the Black community in reference to breaking the cycle of violence and how to mentor kids in at-risk situations. He said, maybe they need, and he's talking to the leaders, maybe they need to fix their own damn house and I'll be there to help. But they have to come up with solutions and they have to come not fighting each other. He means people in the Black community, because I'm tired of trying to play peacemaker between the factions. Ozzy's not running for re-election, which is obvious. What does this say to you?
Well, I'm not going to comment on what he said. I mean, Ozzy, I've dealt with him as U.S. attorney and with his gang unit and this sort of thing. And then I dealt with him on an up close and personal when I was a police chief and all that. And he's got his own style. So I don't know. I'm not going to comment on what he said. I've had similar frustrations because, and again, I would have to tell you that I've been labeled a racist. There were people who objected to me being named the interim police chief. That's a job I didn't even seek, didn't even want. And there were people protesting that because of an editorial I wrote a year prior talking about public official support for the police and quoting the FBI director, Jim Comey, on racial profiling. All I was doing was quoting somebody else, but they labeled me as a racist. And of course, that's the most used and least understood term in today's lexicon. The problem I have, and I've discussed it, let's take the African-American community. 3% of the community of the county is African-American, yet 13% of the jail population is African-American. Well, they immediately say that's unacceptable. I would say the same thing. I would say that is deplorable. That number, that 13%, that shouldn't be. But I say the 13% is the what. I want to know the why. Are you, and this is a discussion I've had, are you going to tell me, willing to tell me that all 13% of those in prison, and that number fluctuates on a daily basis, are the result of racist police, racist judges, inherent bias, et cetera, et cetera? Are you going to tell me that that's the only reason? Or are you willing to say maybe there are other factors? For example, if you look at city crime statistics, remember 3% of the population African American, 16 to 18% over 2017, 2018, for example, 16 to 18% of all the arrestees and assaults are from the same community. 40 to 50% of all the homicides are arrestees. I'm not talking about convictions, I'm talking about arrestees, are from the same community. And the same numbers, out of proportion to the relative position in the community, are throughout rape, robbery, assault, violent crime. So I would say, I'm willing to say yes, racism probably factors into that 13%, but tell me, is that the only thing? Or are there other factors? Over 70% single parent, poverty, unemployment, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, are you willing to discuss the other factors that again, we can attack? We can go after poverty, we can go after unemployment, this sort of thing. But nobody is willing to discuss that. They always point to the police and the judges and say, that's it. Well, maybe it is, but do we really know that? I don't think so. And for that, I've been labeled. So be it.
Well, Jim, you answered that one so well. I've got another one that will hopefully won't vex you. He or she says, I was in the military. I know there are countless victims of sexual crimes and the predators never paid any legal consequences. Does the law need to change, or do we need to change the way we as a society deal with sex crimes?
Well, again, that's a good question, Mark. Two things. One is that is the U.S. Attorney has the ability to designate military prosecutors, military JAGs, as special assistant U.S. attorneys. Now, in San Diego, it shouldn't surprise you that there are probably, I don't know, last count 20, 30 JAGs down there, because that's a Navy town, that are been designated. And that way, the JAG can take cases directly to federal court, whether it's child pornography or drug trafficking, etc. I tried that with Fairchild, and the problem with Fairchild is that the JAGs and everybody at Fairchild rotates in and out so rapidly that I couldn't get anybody in place long enough to get them the training and get them on board as a special assistant U.S. attorney. I think the law is in place, just like gun crime. We've got all the laws we need. We just need to have the guts to enforce them. The same way with sex crimes in the military. We need to have commanders and leaders that are willing to stand up and do that. Even as a reservist, I court-martialed an officer who, over, in part a sex crime and in part lying to me. He was court-martialed. He was a captain. He was dishonorably discharged, which is a kiss of death for an officer. But you got to do that. You have to stand up to that. You have to do what's right without regard to the consequences. And I think that's, I think there's plenty of laws on the books. You just need to attack that culture, and that comes from the leadership.
Excellent. Please tell me he wasn't a navigator.
No, he was a pilot.
Oh, okay. One more from the audience. This one's just a general question, but what can be done to take back our government/country from unelected career members of government, i.e. the bureaucracy? I think this person senses that people that are in government, have been in government for a long time, have a lot of power.
Well, I think you go back to what I was talking about at the very start. And that is, you bring people in, you bring non-career people in to positions of leadership. Mm-hmm. And people who are A, not looking to make it a career, and B, have a job to go back to or have a career to go back to. And then you deal with the dead weight. And sometimes that's difficult. Sometimes it takes time, but it needs to be done. And I think that's how you, quote unquote, take back the government, is you have citizen legislators, citizen leaders, citizen prosecutors, this sort of thing, and people that aren't afraid of ruffling the landscape, ruffling feathers, and not afraid of losing their job.
Excellent. One more question. You kind of covered this in your first question about the Knezevich quote, but this person says, how do you think we can get to a nonpartisan atmosphere with our law enforcers in our current climate? And he says that he feels as though the lines are being drawn along political lines.
Well, that's an outstanding question. And as U.S. Attorney, the U.S. Attorney is an honorary member of WAPA, the Washington Association of Prosecuting Attorneys. For years, WAPA has had an internal debate going that the Office of Prosecuting Attorney should be nonpartisan. And but not to the same degree, the position of sheriff has been argued that position. Law enforcement should not be a partisan function. And that, in fact, I think it's the, I worked with him. I think it's the prosecutor in Asotin County is an independent. And there's been that debate has gone on and still goes on of those who don't think that there ought to be a label Republican Democrat on an elected sheriff or an elected prosecuting attorney. And the same thing, I was, undoubtedly, I was appointed by a Republican president. I've never let politics interfere with the administration of justice. I was continued by Obama for 2 years. I barely the ink was dry on my resignation letter, and I was appointed by Governor Gregoire to the state Clemency and Pardons Board and appointed to do an internal investigation. And I've been reappointed twice to the same board, and I'm now the chair by Governor Inslee. He knows where my loyalties lie. And that's no secret, but I've never allowed that to interfere with the administration of justice. It just shouldn't. That's what the public has a right to demand. I don't know whether that answers the question, but I mean, that's how we get back to where we want to go, is we demand it.
From the start of that question, I think this person has a personal relationship with you, so you may get that question in a follow-up from him or her. I have one more question. This one's an interesting one. I have a friend who was doing some research on this for a doctoral program, but what steps can be taken to ensure that white-collar crimes result in meaningful prison terms, as well as appropriate financial restitution? It seems that white-collar crimes don't receive the same level of punishment often as blue-collar crimes. Now, is that just that white-collar criminals have more money, better lawyers, or better connections? Do you see
yes,
there?
yes, and yes, and yes. First of all, oftentimes you're going after the entity, the corporation or the entity, in order to get to the deep pocket. You can't send the entity to jail. You can send, as you've seen in certain cases, you can send some of the guilty executives to prison, and that happens not as often as you might see in drug cases or murder for hire or the kinds of cases the U.S. Attorney usually sees. Oftentimes, a best resolution, if you're going to resolve it, is a financial resolution to try to make whole people that have lost. That's always been, and quite frankly, that's been internally debated time and time again as to, why don't the white collar offenders go to prison more often? And I think it's symptomatic. I think the biggest, number one, you can't send a corporation to jail, and number two, you're really trying to get restitution. But in the most egregious cases, and you can point to a couple of them, like Bernie Madoff and some of those, if it rises to that level, somebody's going to go to jail.
Yeah, the one I'm thinking of would be the Enron folks. A lot of their leaders went to prison for varying lengths.
Yeah.
But that ruined a lot of people's lives. Barb, we have one more question on our sheet there if you'd like to answer it, or ask it, excuse me.
Okay, you have spent a career working in the justice arena in many roles, including briefly as the civilian chief of police here in Spokane. What do you see, or would you like to see, as a path forward from our current climate of unrest?
Well, I'm probably the wrong guy to ask that. I wholly endorse the right to protest, the right to march and to protest, and the freedom of speech. But I draw the line at violence, at burning, looting, breaking windows, hurting people. My answer to that is you put the hammer down. I mean, I'm sorry, but that's just the way it is. I think we just have to draw the line and say, look, I'm all for the protest. I'm all for that, but if you're going to go out and start breaking windows and tearing up stores and ruining people's livelihood, and in fact, even if it's the neighborhood you live in and some of your neighbors, I mean, that just it isn't going to happen. I see that the United States, whom I know, the United States Attorney in Portland is under fire from the mayor because of enforcing violations around the federal courthouse. Well, Mayor, that's the way it's going to be. Like I've told many a city official, like it or not, it's my jurisdiction and I'll take it. You don't like it? And I can remember people telling me how powerful they were, and they knew the president, and they knew Patty Murray, and they knew Maria Cantwell, and I would just hand them my card and say, here, spell my name right. Never did I get contacted by any representative or Senator Murray and Senator Cantwell. Actually, both of those individuals helped move my name through the Senate rapidly, because I knew them and they knew me through the military, and thought, well, you know, I'd rather be putting a Democrat in here, but you're okay. So that's what you need to expect.
Well, I would just say I appreciate your answer. And there was protests in every major city in America, it seems like, especially Minneapolis, LA, some of the bigger cities. We can't really, do you think it's fair to treat the groups as monolithic, or were there some different agendas going on within those protests, Washington, D.C. included?
No, they're absolutely, Mark, different agendas. And that's the problem. The protest itself, that's warranted. I mean, that's fine, and I welcome it, and people need to wake up to that. But you've got people, especially Portland is a good example or bad example. You've got people that hijack those protests and turn them into violence. And the protesters themselves don't want that to happen, because they know that distracts, because we tend to group it all together because they want to meld in with the crowd. And you can't, I mean, somebody asked the police chief in Seattle, well, can't you pick out the protesters from the Antifa? You haven't been in a big crowd of people yelling and screaming and throwing rocks. No, you can't. And so when you give the order to disperse, regardless of whether you're on the right side or the wrong side, you better disperse, because you know, bad things are going to happen. Portland, for example, one thing we were involved in, Portland had a real radical environmental group down there. They were responsible, called the Family, and they were responsible for burning down a ski area. I think the University of Washington horticulture lab was burned down. A number of logging operations, and that came out of Portland, or that came out of Oregon. And we were concerned with Washington State University's animal research lab, because there were some threats made to that. And I went down there with ATF, alcohol, tobacco, firearms, and explosives, and made a visit down there. And we were afraid that might be a target, because there were some warning signs. And that came out of Oregon again. And there was a young woman, I think there was a book out about it, who went undercover. And she spent 3 years at the risk of risking her life as a member of the Family. And we ended up with enough over on the west side to indict about 25 people that were part of this eco-terrorist group that were responsible for a number of fires and destruction, this sort of thing. But that all emanated out of Oregon. Not that you couldn't find it elsewhere, but that was out of Oregon.
Well, thanks, Jim. Thank you for your thoughtful replies to those questions. A couple of tough ones there. Hope you didn't feel like we put upon you too much.
No.
And at this point, I'll turn it over to our president, Jenny Darrell, to give some closing remarks.
Well, I want to thank you very much for joining us this evening, Mr. McDevitt.
Thank you, Jenny.
Thank you. We value your time with us. And I want to thank the audience for joining us. We hope you enjoyed this evening's PEG event, and that you'll join us again on August the 11th. Our guests will be the Washington Secretary of State, Kim Wyman, and the Spokane County Auditor, Vicki Dalton. A video of tonight's event will be posted on our website, www.pegnow.org, within a couple of weeks. Thank you all, and have a pleasant evening.